Genesis 21, 8 through 21. The child grew and was weaned, and Abraham made a great feast on the day that Isaac was weaned. But Sarah saw the son of Hagar the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, playing with her son Isaac. So she said to Abraham, "Cast out this slave woman with her son, for the son of this slave woman will not inherit along with my son Isaac." The matter was very distressing to Abraham on account of his son. But God said to Abraham, "Do not be distressed because of the boy and because of your slave woman. Whatever Sarah says to you, do as she tells you, for it is through Isaac that offspring shall be named for you. As for the son of the slave woman, I will make a nation of him also, because he is your offspring." So Abraham rose early in the morning and took a bread and a skin of water and gave it to Hagar, putting it on her shoulder along with the child, and sent her away. And she departed and wandered about in the wilderness of Beersheba. When the water in the skin was gone, she cast the child under one of the bushes. Then she went and sat opposite him a good way off, about the distance of a bow shot, for she said, "Do not let me look upon the death of the child." And as she sat opposite him, she lifted up her voice and wept. And God heard the voice of the boy, and the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, "What troubles you, Hagar? Do not be afraid, for God has heard the voice of the boy where he is. Come, lift up the boy and hold him fast with your hand, for I will make a great nation of him." Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. She went and filled the skin with water and gave the boy a drink. God was with the boy, and he grew up. He lived in the wilderness and became an expert with the bow. He lived in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother got a wife for him from the land of Egypt.
Again, I'd like to introduce Jerrell Williams from Salem Mennonite Church. Jerrell, thank you for sharing with us, and I'd like to offer a prayer up for you at this time. Thank you, God, for Jerrell and his gifts and his willingness to share and trade pulpit with Pastor Peter. And we just pray that the words that we hear today will open our hearts and our minds, and that we can use the words to be examples for you. In your name I pray, amen.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for having me this morning with you all. Can everyone hear me okay? Just a thumbs up if you can hear me. Okay, great. Sorry I look a little weird with my headphones on, but that's the only way I can hear you all when you're speaking as well. So I am really excited to be with you all this morning. Greetings from your sibling church, Salem Mennonite Church, who is enjoying a great sermon from Pastor Peter right now as we speak. And so, yeah, I'm excited to be with you all this morning. This pulpit swap has been a long time coming. Me and Peter, when I first came out here, had already discussed the creativity and imagined what this would be like. And so I'm excited that it's finally here. A little bit about myself. My name is Jerrell Williams, pronounced Jerrell, not Jerrell. And I have been pastoring at SMC for a little over a year and a half. And so I was raised in Dallas, Texas. So y'all will hear me say y'all quite a bit. I attended college at Bethel College in Newton, Kansas. In fact, Claire Unruh and I attended Bethel at the same time. And so I believe that Claire was either a junior or senior when I came in my freshman year. And we actually took a Greek class together as well, and vocation seminar. So I know Claire decently well, and yeah, I'm glad that she's with you all here at Albany. After my time at Bethel, me and Sierra, my wife, got married and moved out to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where I attended Pittsburgh Theological Seminary. And after my time at seminary, I accepted the call to pastor at Salem Mennonite Church. And so I'm glad to be with you all this morning. I wish we could be in person, but we're trying to stay safe and not get the COVID right now. So Zoom will have to suffice for now. So this morning, we'll be looking at the story of Hagar. And Hagar's story is one of the saddest stories within the biblical text, but I believe that it is also one that we can really learn a lot from as Christians in our world today. In this story, Hagar, who was an immigrant slave to Abraham's wife Sarah, is going through an extremely oppressive and difficult situation. And so today we will look at God's surprising response to Hagar's situation and how she becomes one of the blessed ones. And so Hagar's story is interesting, and it is sprinkled into the stories of Abraham and Sarah. We are first introduced to Hagar in Genesis chapter 16, as Sarah and Abraham are struggling to conceive a child. During this time, it was of the utmost importance to have a son so that you could continue your family line and pass down your legacy. Hagar is originally brought into this story. She's introduced in the story of Abraham and Sarah to solve a problem for them. Since Sarah and Abraham had been struggling to have a child, Sarah suggests that Abraham sleeps with Hagar so that he might finally have a child. Now, for us in this time, that sounds ridiculous, but back then, this was not an uncommon practice. Theologian Gerhard von Rad says that during this time, and I quote, "The wife could bring to the marriage her own personal maid, who was not available to her husband as a concubine in the same way his own female slaves were. If she gave her personal maid to her husband in the event of her own childlessness, then the child born of the maid was considered the wife's child. From the legal and moral standpoint, therefore, Sarah's proposal was completely according to custom." End quote. And like I said, I know this is not something that we would necessarily practice today or accept today, but in this time period, it was a common and acceptable practice. It is important to remember here that earlier in the book of Genesis, God had made a promise to Abraham that they would have a child and that he would be the descendant of nations. By Sarah suggesting that Abraham lie with Hagar in order to have children, she was showing the distrust that they both had in God's promises. So Sarah tells Abraham to lie with Hagar so that they can claim the child as their own. Abraham agrees to do this, and Hagar becomes pregnant and has a baby boy named Ishmael. Once Hagar had her baby, the Bible tells us that even though it had been Sarah's idea, Sarah grew in contempt with Hagar and dealt with her harshly. After being mistreated by Sarah, Hagar escapes and runs away into the wilderness. While in the wilderness, God comes to Hagar and asks her where she is going. Hagar tells God about how she had been treated by Abraham and Sarah. Now, typically, I have come to expect God to encourage Hagar's running away, but that is not the God that we get in chapter 16 of Genesis. This story presents the flaw of our idea of liberation theology, or a theology of liberation. God in this story is not the liberating God. God instead tells Hagar to return to Sarah and submit to her. God then gives Hagar a promise that may sound familiar to many of us. God tells her that, and I quote, "I will so greatly multiply your offspring that they cannot be counted for multitude." End quote. Hagar then gives God a name after this first encounter. She names God El Roi, meaning the God who sees me. Our story for today, so moving ahead, fast forwarding to Genesis, our Genesis passage for today, our story finds Hagar in the wilderness once again. Not because she ran away this time, but because once Sarah had given birth to her child Isaac, she no longer recognizes the need for the connection of Hagar and Ishmael and forced Hagar out of the home. God fulfilled God's promise to Abraham and Sarah by giving them a child of their own. And now Sarah wanted Hagar and Ishmael out of the picture. Hagar's role in this story was done. Now, this may sound like a blessing that Hagar finally gets released from slavery and she is no longer a slave to Sarah, but Sarah actually kicked Hagar out and her newborn baby Ishmael, kicked them out of the house and into the wilderness, into the desert to die. Hagar was so sure that her child would die that she placed Ishmael under a bush and walked away because she could not stand to see him die. Picture the single mother out on the street with her child and no place to go. God appeared to her again and told her to not be afraid, for God has heard the voice of Ishmael, and God will make a great nation out of him. Hagar picks up Ishmael, and God opens her eyes to see a well where they can go and get fresh water. These two passages about Hagar are troubling to say the least. She is an immigrant slave who is forced to have a baby, the baby of one of her masters. She is then kicked out into the wilderness to die. She has been oppressed her entire life. Even when she tries to escape from slavery, God, who is supposed to be the liberator, sends her back into an oppressed position. Now, one thing to note about this passage is that this passage in this story doesn't center around liberation. God doesn't necessarily rescue Hagar from the situation that she is in. And typically, when I preach, and you can ask my folks at Salem Mennonite about this, I always talk about liberation from the oppressed, God who will free those who are in bondage. But that is not the God that we see in this story. In Hagar's story, God is more of the survival God. In her book, Sisters in the Wilderness, womanist theologian Dolores Williams points out that Hagar's interactions with God gave her the tools to survive the oppression that she was in. God provided for Hagar in her times of need. God met Hagar in the wilderness when she first ran away from Sarah and promised her that she would bear a son who would be the father of nations. God met Hagar when she was left to die in the wilderness and provided water to her. God walked with Hagar and her son Ishmael for the rest of their days. Though life was hard, though they were forced to live in the wilderness, God was with them every step of the way. Did y'all know that Hagar was actually the first person to give God a name? The Bible tells us that to name God is one of the biggest honors. Hagar not only names God, but she sees God. She talks with God. She walks with God. She grows a special relationship and bond with God that only she would understand. God even gives Hagar the same promise that God bestowed upon Abraham. She will be the mother of numerous descendants. Now, typically, it is the men in the Bible who passed down their legacies and lineage to their descendants. But in this passage, God chooses Hagar as the one who will mother nations. God in this story becomes the God of accompaniment, the God who walks with the oppressed throughout all of their situations. Here in this passage, we don't see the God of liberation, but we do see the God who walks with the oppressed, the God who walks with us, a God who walks with the poor, the slave, and the struggling. Hagar, the immigrant slave, becomes blessed by God because God saw the oppression that she was under. God's unique relationship with Hagar is special because of who God is to the oppressed. God saw Hagar's struggle and walked with her through that struggle. Hagar is blessed because she has a relationship with God that only she can understand. You see, I believe that we as American Christians have a misunderstanding of the term blessing. We say we are blessed because of the things that God gives us. We say that we are blessed to have money or wealth, or I am blessed to have a nice house or a nice car. And pastors who preach the prosperity gospel talk like this all the time. In our minds, we paint a picture of who is blessed and who isn't blessed. We say that if you are struggling or poor, then you can't possibly be blessed, or at least not as blessed as I am. Last year, in 2020, among all the chaos that was happening, the topic of blessings came up in a conversation between the Christian rapper Lecrae and the megachurch pastor Louis Giglio. They met together to talk about the Black Lives Matter movement and how they can get people to better understand racism in America. And in this conversation, Pastor Giglio said something that was completely outlandish. He said, and I quote, "We understand the curse that was slavery. White people do. And we say that this was bad, but we miss the blessing of slavery, that it actually built up the framework for the world that white people live in." End quote. He goes on to say that we shouldn't use the term white privilege. He argued that we should use the term white blessing. And by white blessing, he means that it was a blessing for white people in this country to have enslaved and oppressed Black people. Now, this is a ludicrous idea for several reasons, but it points out how we as American Christians have come to think about blessings. We think of blessings as the things that we have in comparison to the things that other people do not have. Pastor Giglio, in his statement, puts forward this idea that those on top of society are the blessed, and those at the bottom of society are the cursed. And this idea has seeped into modern Christianity. On social media, if you're on social media, on Twitter or Facebook, you will see people post a picture of them doing something cool, and then they'll post with it the caption that says #blessed. But what does it actually mean to be blessed? Are the wealthy ones the ones who are blessed? Is it the top of our society who are the blessed ones? Jesus, in his Sermon on the Mount, tells us who the blessed are. Jesus says, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Here Jesus tells us who the blessed are. The blessed are the Hagars who suffer through oppression. Blessed are the Black folks who have faced discrimination in America for hundreds of years. Blessed are the women who have had to fight for their rights. Blessed are the LGBTQ folks who have to spend so much of their lives in fear and have to explain their very existence to people. Blessed are the immigrants who have come to a foreign land in hopes of freedom, only to be hunted down and turned away. Blessed are those with disabilities who have been ignored within our communities. Friends, these are the ones who God deems as blessed. Hagar in our story for today is seen as someone who is blessed. Though she isn't Jewish like Abraham, though she isn't wealthy like Abraham, though she isn't a man like Abraham is, yet she is the one who receives the same promise that Abraham receives. She is the one who sees God's face and lives to tell the tale. She is the one who receives the opportunity to name God first. She is the one who gets to walk with God for the rest of her days. Hagar, the foreigner at the bottom of society, becomes the one who is blessed. And friends, according to the words of Jesus, we need to change the way that we talk and think about blessings. Hagar is blessed because she has a relationship with God that only someone who has gone through what she has gone through can understand. What we can learn from Hagar's story is that we don't need to be with the Abrahams and the Sarahs, but we need to be with the Hagars. We need to walk, talk, pray, and suffer with the Hagars in our society today. We don't do this because they need to be saved. We don't need to try and be the saviors of people. We do this because these are the ones who God has deemed as blessed. And if we want to truly see God in a new way, if we want to know God fully, then we need to be with the Hagars. We need to be with the oppressed. Back when I was living in Kansas, I had the opportunity to serve as the director of prison ministries for an organization named Offender Victim Ministries. I remember that I often talked about the good things that our organization did for the men in prison who were incarcerated. We would set up visits for them and have our volunteers come into the prison and set up visits. We would do like theater performances with them. We would help them write poetry and letters and different kinds of things. And so we were a part of, we were serving these folks in this way and helping them have some kind of connection with the outside world. And this week, as I was reflecting on this text, I remembered that I was blessed to be in the presence of these incarcerated men. I learned something about God that I never knew existed. I talk about and I preach about God's forgiveness, But some of those guys in prison knew God's forgiveness firsthand. I talk about the need to trust in God, but those guys showed me what it was like to trust God when your back is against the wall. Friends, if you want to see who God truly is, look for the Hagars within your own community. Look for the oppressed. Look for the hurting. Look for the poor and the downtrodden, because these are the ones who know and understand God way better than some of us could ever understand. The God that we serve walks with those who are hurting. The God that we serve is on the side of the oppressed. The God that we serve blesses those who are hurting and reveals God's self to them. And if God is there with the oppressed, if God is walking with and accompanying the lowest within our society, then that is where we all should be, listening to their stories, walking alongside them, suffering in solidarity next to them. Our God isn't the most present with the religious elites. Our God is not the most present with the wealthy. Our God is not the most present with the top of our society. But our God is with the oppressed. And if that is where God is, then we need to be there too, so that we too can see God's face. Peace.